"So," he said, leaning back, "you think you're qualified to manage communications for my international division?" He chuckled and glanced at the other executives, who chuckled too. "Let's make it interesting. If your daughter can translate what I'm about to say in Russian—" He paused, savoring the cruelty. "I'll hire you on the spot." The room erupted in polite laughter. The boardroom smelled like money, cold leather chairs, polished oak tables, and the faint metallic scent of wealth. It was the kind of room where decisions worth millions were made, and where people like them were never supposed to belong. Amelia adjusted the hem of her daughter's second-hand dress, her fingers trembling slightly. This meeting, this one shot, could change their lives. Across the room, Richard Caldwell, tech billionaire and self-proclaimed visionary, scanned them with a smirk that never reached his eyes. "So," he said, leaning back, "you think you're qualified to manage communications for my international division?" He chuckled and glanced at the other executives, who chuckled too. "Let's make it interesting. If your daughter can translate what I'm about to say in Russian—" He paused, savoring the cruelty. "I'll hire you on the spot." The room erupted in polite laughter. Amelia's chest tightened. She hadn't mentioned that her 13-year-old daughter, Zoe, had spent years listening to Russian audiobooks while her mom cleaned hotel rooms at night. She hadn't needed to. This was her interview, not Zoe's. But Richard's words weren't about language. They were about humiliation. Zoe stared at the floor, the weight of 100 unspoken insults pressing down on her. "They think we're nothing. They think we don't belong here." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Well, silence. The kind that stings. The type that brands itself into your memory." And then Zoe looked up, her eyes no longer shy but sharp, unflinching. She parted her lips. The following words would not only shatter every stereotype in that room, they would change their future forever. But this was only the beginning. Zoe Caldwell had always known she was different, not because of anything she had done, but because the world never stopped reminding her. From the moment she stepped into her kindergarten classroom in Atlanta, bright-eyed, hair in neat braids, holding her mother's hand, she felt the weight of eyes that didn't quite see her. Teachers praised her surprisingly good vocabulary. Other parents asked Amelia if Zoe was adopted because she seemed so articulate, and children, parroting words they didn't yet understand, sometimes wondered if her mom worked for one of their families. It was 1,000 little cuts that left no visible scars. But Amelia had a gift. She knew how to turn pain into purpose. "They're going to underestimate you, baby," she would say every morning before school, cupping Zoe's face in her hands. "And that's your secret weapon. Because when they look down on you, they won't see you coming." Amelia herself had been underestimated her whole life. She had been a high-achieving student in her own right, valedictorian, debate champion. But when she became pregnant with Zoe at 19, her future was rewritten by people who decided they knew her story before they'd even met her. Employers looked at her resume and saw single black mother before they saw communications prodigy. Once open, doors slammed shut. Still, she fought. She took night shifts, cleaning hotels, early morning shifts at a diner, and online classes in between. It was during one of those bleary-eyed study sessions that she fell in love with languages. Russian, in particular. Language, she would tell Zoe, is power. The more of them you speak, the fewer people can speak over you. Their apartment was small but filled with stories, literal ones. Amelia lined the shelves with second-hand books, most of them in English, a few in Russian. She played Russian radio shows while she cooked dinner, letting Russian news broadcasts fill the background as they folded laundry. Zoe didn't understand most of it at first. Still, she listened, the way a musician listens to melody before learning lyrics, and she loved it. She loved the strange rhythm of the words, the way they danced on the tongue. Soon she was mimicking sounds, repeating phrases. By the time she was 9, she was reading Russian fairy tales aloud, her accent almost flawless. Amelia watched with quiet pride. "One day," she whispered, "this will open doors you don't even know exist yet." But the outside world was not so kind. At school, Zoe's curiosity was labeled showing off. Her knowledge was dismissed as luck. When she answered questions too quickly, classmates rolled their eyes. When she spoke up in debates, some teachers subtly steered the conversation away from her. And when she won a regional essay competition, beating out students from wealthy prep schools, a parent accused her of plagiarism. It was always the same subtext, dressed in different words. Someone like you isn't supposed to be this good. For Amelia, the goal had always been clear: build a future where Zoe would never have to choose between survival and self-worth. She dreamed of working for a global communications firm, the kind that handled international partnerships and diplomacy. Her language skills and strategic mind made her an ideal candidate. There was just one problem. People like Richard Caldwell controlled those doors. Caldwell Communications was a powerhouse in the corporate world, multi-million-dollar contracts with foreign governments, tech giants, and humanitarian organizations. They prided themselves on diversity initiatives and inclusive leadership, but behind the PR statements was a culture steeped in elitism and unspoken hierarchies. Amelia had applied for a senior communications role 3 times before. Each time she was rejected. No explanation, no feedback. Just silence. When a recruiter finally called her back for a 4th interview, she knew this was more than an opportunity. It was a test. The days leading up to the interview were grueling. Amelia prepared presentations, practiced mock Q&As, and even rehearsed her handshake. She bought a second-hand suit and had it tailored to perfection. She wanted there to be no excuse for them to dismiss her this time. Still, the small humiliations piled up. At the interview building's reception desk, the woman behind the counter didn't look up when Amelia introduced herself. "Deliveries are around back," she said flatly. "I'm not here for a delivery," Amelia replied calmly. "I'm here for an interview." The woman blinked, startled, and finally glanced up. "Oh, right. Of course." Later, as Amelia waited in the lobby, a well-dressed white man walked past her and asked, "Excuse me, can you bring me a coffee?" When she told him she was a candidate, he stammered, "Oh, I just assumed—" These weren't accidents. They were reminders of the unwritten rules of spaces like this. You're not supposed to be here. And if you are, you must prove you belong. Zoe noticed it all. Even when Amelia tried to hide her frustration behind a smile, Zoe saw the way her shoulders tightened. She heard the sighs late at night. She caught snippets of whispered prayers before job interviews. "I hate how they look at you," Zoe said one evening as they walked home from the library. Amelia squeezed her hand. "They don't define us. Remember that. But they act like we're less," Zoe murmured. Amelia stopped and knelt to meet her daughter's eyes. "And that's why we show them we're not. We don't shrink. We don't apologize. We excel. Because the best revenge against prejudice is undeniable excellence." Those words rooted themselves deep inside Zoe, a promise she intended to keep. 2 weeks before the interview, something unexpected happened. Amelia received an email not just inviting her to a final interview, but also to a networking lunch with the company's executive team. Most candidates never got this chance. It was a signal. She was being seriously considered. It also meant she'd be stepping into an arena far more hostile than a conference room. The event was held at an exclusive private club in Buckhead, the kind of place with valet parking and art installations worth more than their apartment. Zoe, who had the day off from school, came along, mostly because Amelia couldn't afford a babysitter. She promised her daughter it would be quick. The room was filled with tailored suits, clinking glasses, and polite, performative laughter. As they entered, conversations dipped, eyes flicked toward them. Amelia felt the sting of judgment before anyone said a word. One executive leaned toward another and whispered, not quietly enough, "Did she bring her kid because she couldn't afford childcare?" Another smirked. "Or maybe it's take your daughter to work day. If you have work." Amelia ignored them, head held high. But Zoe's fists clenched at her sides. They don't even know her, she thought. And they're already laughing. During lunch, Richard Caldwell, a man whose ego was as expensive as his watch, turned his attention to Zoe. "So, young lady," he said, swirling his wine, What does your mother tell you she does for a living? Zoe hesitated. She helps people talk to each other, she answered softly. Ah, Richard smirked. A translator. A glorified middleman. He chuckled and turned to the table. In my world, we build empires. We don't just talk about them. Laughter rippled across the table. Amelia's cheeks burned, but she forced a smile. Communication is how empires are built, she said evenly. Without understanding, there's no deal, no partnership, no progress. Richard's smirk faded for a moment, but only for a moment. We'll see if you're right, he said, his tone suddenly sharper. The interview will be illuminating. Zoe's heart pounded. Something about the way he said it felt like a threat. That night, Amelia and Zoe sat at their kitchen table, papers and language notes spread out before them. Are you nervous? Zoe asked. Of course I am, Amelia admitted, but I'm more determined than nervous. This isn't just about a job, Zoe. It's about what people like him think we can't do. Zoe hesitated. What if he tries to humiliate you? Amelia smiled gently. Then he'll regret underestimating us. Zoe thought about those words long after her mother went to bed. She replayed the laughter, the smug faces, the cutting remarks. And she made a silent promise. If he tries anything, I won't stay quiet. 2 days before the interview, Zoe stumbled across something online, a press release announcing that Caldwell Communications had secured a significant contract with a Russian tech conglomerate. The deal was worth hundreds of millions and hinged on flawless cross-cultural communication. Her heart raced. That's why he cares so much about language, she realized. That's why he mocked Mom. She stayed up that night revisiting her old Russian textbooks, watching interviews, refining her pronunciation. It wasn't part of any plan. It was just instinct, a feeling that something big was coming. The morning of the interview dawned cold and gray, rain tapping softly against their apartment window. Amelia dressed carefully, every detail deliberate. The suit, the shoes, the portfolio of work samples. Zoe wore her favorite navy dress, the one Amelia said made her look like the future. They rode the bus downtown in silence. Amelia reviewed notes. Zoe stared out the window, lost in thought. As they stepped into the glass tower that housed Caldwell Communications, Zoe felt her pulse quicken. Everything smelled sterile and expensive. Polished marble floors, fresh-cut orchids, the faint hint of espresso from the executive lounge. They checked in at the front desk. The receptionist's eyes flickered with surprise when Amelia introduced herself as a candidate. It was a familiar look, the you don't look like you belong here look. They waited in the lobby for what felt like an eternity before a tall man in a charcoal suit approached. Ms. Carter? He asked. Mr. Caldwell will see you now. The interview wasn't in a standard office. It was in the company's executive boardroom, the heart of power. Amelia felt her stomach tighten as they entered. 12 people sat around the table, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to open skepticism. Richard Caldwell sat at the head, a predator in silk. Ms. Carter, he said smoothly, thank you for coming. We like to make these interviews memorable. Zoe's chest tightened. She knew what was coming. She could feel it, and then, as if scripted, Richard leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and smirked. If your daughter can translate what I'm about to say in Russian... He paused, letting the cruelty linger. I'll hire you on the spot. The laughter was immediate, sharp, cutting. Zoe's heart thundered. This is it. This is the moment. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, charged, the kind that makes even air feel heavier. Zoe could hear her heartbeat in her ears as Richard Caldwell's words echoed like a taunt across polished walls. If your daughter can translate what I'm about to say in Russian, I'll hire you on the spot. For a fleeting moment, no one moved. Amelia sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, her smile measured and polite. The same practiced smile she'd worn countless times when people tried to belittle her. But beneath the surface, something coiled tighter and tighter. Zoe's stomach churned. She could walk away. She could pretend she didn't understand. That's what Richard wanted. for them to leave humiliated, to confirm his belief that they didn't belong. But a voice, soft yet fierce, rose in her mind. Don't shrink. Don't apologize. Excel. It wasn't like Zoe had known this moment would come. She hadn't plotted a dramatic confrontation or prepared to humiliate a billionaire. But in the days leading up to the interview, something inside her had shifted. She had read every Russian news article she could find and practiced pronunciation with free videos. She even listened to Russian podcasts while brushing her teeth. It wasn't about showing off. It was about being ready, even if she didn't know for what. Amelia had noticed. "You're working awfully hard on your Russian," she'd said, stirring a pot of pasta on their rickety stove. Zoe shrugged. "I just want to be good at it." "Zoe, you are good at it," Amelia said, smiling. "But remember, you don't need to prove anything to anyone." Zoe met her mother's eyes. "Maybe not, but they need to see what I can do." The truth was, Zoe wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for every sneer, every dismissive glance. Every time her mom had been told she was too ambitious. She was doing it for every teacher who'd been surprised when she aced a test, every cashier who'd assumed they were on food stamps, every classmate's parent who'd clutched their purse a little tighter around them. Most of all, she was doing it for the woman sitting beside her, the woman who had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and her own dreams to build a future for them both. Zoe had no plan beyond that resolve. But sometimes resolve was all you needed. Richard cleared his throat dramatically. "All right, then," he said, his tone dripping with theatrical mockery. "Let's make this fun." He launched into a complex sentence in Russian, deliberately fast, deliberately technical. It wasn't a simple greeting or phrase. It was the kind of corporate jargon that would trip up even seasoned translators. The room watched, expectant, hungry for the spectacle. One executive leaned over to another and whispered, "This is cruel." The other snickered, "It's entertaining." Amelia's chest tightened. "This isn't fair." He's turning a job interview into a circus. Zoe inhaled slowly. The words weren't easy, but they weren't impossible. Her mind raced, translating piece by piece, stitching meaning together like a puzzle. She knew this vocabulary. She'd read it in the articles about the Russian conglomerate. Her lips parted. And then she hesitated. Not because she couldn't do it. Because this wasn't the right moment. Not yet. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Richard tilted his head, a satisfied smile curling on his lips. "No," he said, feigning sympathy. "That's all right. I didn't expect—" "I understand," Zoe interrupted, her voice calm but steady. "I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly." The room shifted. Whispers died. Richard blinked, not expecting defiance. "Go on then," he said, leaning back. "We're all waiting." Zoe took another breath, this time more confident. And word by word, flawlessly, she translated the entire sentence. No stumbles, no hesitations, no mercy. For a moment there was silence, a heavy, disbelieving silence. Then a low murmur rippled through the room. "Did she just—" "Perfect grammar. Her accent is native level." Richard's smile faltered, but he forced a laugh. "Not bad," he said casually, as if he hadn't just been blindsided. "Let's try something harder." He spoke again, this time switching dialects, Moscow-accented Russian full of idioms and cultural references. It was a dirty tactic, but it was all he had left. And again, Zoe followed. The idioms, the tone, even the subtle shifts in meaning, she caught them all. By the third sentence, she was translating faster than he was speaking. The executives exchanged glances. One of them, a Russian-born consultant, leaned forward. "She's not just translating," he said quietly. "She's interpreting nuance. That's rare." Richard's jaw tightened. This wasn't the humiliation he had scripted. For the first time in his career, Richard Caldwell, a man used to controlling every room he walked into, was losing control. And worse, he knew it. Who is this girl? He thought, eyes narrowing. And how did she learn this? The answer was more straightforward, and more devastating than he could imagine. She learned it because he assumed she couldn't. Amelia watched, heart pounding. Pride swelled in her chest, but so did fear. This was going beyond a demonstration. This was turning into a duel. And duels had consequences. When the exercise was over, the room broke into scattered applause. But Richard didn't clap. He just stared, cold and calculating. "Impressive," he said finally. "But language skills don't guarantee competence. We don't hire translators. We hire strategists." "Then maybe," Amelia replied calmly, "you should consider hiring someone who can be both." The room went silent again. Richard's smile was gone now, replaced by something harder, meaner. "We'll see," he muttered. As they left the boardroom, Amelia's hands were shaking. "You shouldn't have had to do that," she whispered to Zoe in the elevator. Zoe shrugged. "I wanted to." Amelia smiled, a small, tired smile. "You were brilliant." But deep down, she knew the battle wasn't over. Richard was embarrassed, and powerful men who felt humiliated often struck back. Later that evening, in a corner office high above the city, Richard met with his senior executives. The mood was sour. "She made a fool of you," one of them said bluntly. "She embarrassed our company," another added. Richard's eyes were icy. "No," he said. "She made a spectacle of herself, and I'm going to make sure she regrets it." "How?" "By showing her she's not ready for this world." Amelia couldn't sleep. The image of Richard's expression, that mix of wounded pride and simmering rage, replayed over and over. "Maybe I pushed too far," she murmured aloud. "No," Zoe said from across the room. She was still awake, too. "You didn't push far enough," Amelia chuckled softly. "You sound like your grandmother." "I just hate that people like him get to decide everything," Zoe whispered. "Who gets a job? Who gets respect?" Amelia walked over and sat on the edge of Zoe's bed. "They don't get to decide who you are. That's the one thing they can't touch. But they do decide what happens next." Amelia sighed. "Maybe, but we're not done fighting yet." 2 days later, a letter arrived. Amelia's heart raced as she opened it. But the contents were exactly what she feared. "Thank you for your time. While we were impressed by your background, we have decided to move forward with other candidates who better align with our strategic vision. In other words, no." Her chest tightened. All those hours, all that preparation, all for nothing. Zoe found her sitting silently at the kitchen table, the letter in her hand. "He said no?" Amelia nodded. Zoe clenched her fists. "Then we fight back." "What do you mean?" Amelia asked. "You always taught me that language is power," Zoe said. "So let's use it. If he won't hire you, let's show the world what he's trying to hide." Amelia frowned. "Zoe?" But Zoe wasn't backing down. "They want to make people like us invisible. We can't let them." That night, they drafted a detailed blog post, part memoir, part exposé, describing the humiliating interview and the systemic biases that permeated companies like Caldwell Communications. They didn't name names, but they didn't have to. The story spoke for itself. They hesitated before hitting publish. Amelia's hand hovered over the mouse. "Once this is out there, there's no going back," she whispered. Zoe placed her hand over her mother's. "Then let's go forward." Click. The post spread faster than either of them anticipated. First among friends and family, then among advocacy groups, then on larger platforms. By the end of the week, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Comments poured in. "This is why representation matters. I've been through the same thing. Hire this woman. Immediately." News outlets reached out for interviews. Activists tagged Caldwell Communications on social media, demanding answers. Investors asked questions, and then one message stood out. "I represent a Russian-American tech firm looking for a communications strategist fluent in Russian and English. Can we talk?" Amelia read the message 3 times, unsure if it was real. But it was, and the company was one of Caldwell's biggest competitors. The interview process was swift and respectful. They didn't ask humiliating questions. They didn't test Zoe. They asked Amelia about her vision, experience, and goals. When they offered her the position, with a salary higher than Caldwell's, Amelia sat in stunned silence. "Are you going to accept?" Zoe asked, eyes wide. Amelia smiled. "Oh, I'm going to do more than that." She accepted the offer the next morning. And a week later, When news broke that Caldwell Communications had lost a $200 million Russian contract due to communication issues, Amelia knew precisely why. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because soon Richard Caldwell would learn the most important lesson of his life. Power built on prejudice is far more fragile than it looks. The morning of the press conference felt electric, the kind of day where the air itself buzzed with something inevitable. Atlanta's skyline glittered beneath a pale autumn sun as news vans lined the street outside the Hyatt Regency. Inside, journalists, cameras, and industry insiders swarmed the ballroom like bees to honey. Caldwell Communications was about to announce a massive international partnership, a deal that would reshape its global presence. Richard Caldwell had been bragging about it for weeks, but behind the polished press releases and carefully worded statements, there was one problem he hadn't solved. The Russian partners had pulled out. Publicly, the reason was strategic misalignment. Privately, it was because they'd learned, through a particular viral blog post, how Caldwell treated people who understood their culture better than he did. And now they were preparing to sign a new deal with Amelia Carter's new employer. 2 days before the conference, Amelia's phone rang. It was her new boss, Viktor Lebedev, CEO of Lumatrans Global, Caldwell's fiercest rival. "Amelia," he said in his deep, deliberate accent, "I have a question. How would you feel about representing us at the press conference?" Amelia froze. "That press conference?" "Yes," Victor chuckled. "Caldwell doesn't know we will be there. But I think it would be poetic." She almost said no. The thought of standing on that stage, of facing Richard Caldwell again, made her stomach knot. But then she thought of Zoe. She thought of every door that had been slammed shut. And she thought of the laughter in that boardroom. "I'll do it," she said. Richard strode onto the stage with his usual arrogance, soaking in the camera flashes and applause. "Good morning," he began, flashing his PR-trained smile. "Today marks a new era for Caldwell Communications. As we expand into Eastern Europe, we are proud to—" He stopped. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Viktor Lebedev stepped onto the stage from the side door, flanked by Amelia Carter and her daughter. Richard's face drained of color. What is this?" Victor extended a hand. "Apologies for the interruption, Richard. But I thought it only fair to let the world know that our company, I'm not yours, will be partnering with Rusnet Technologies." The room exploded in chatter. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters shouted questions. What happened to Caldwell's deal? Why did Rusnet switch partners? Is this related to the discrimination allegations? Richard's smile twitched. "Allegations," he said through gritted teeth. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victor gestured toward Amelia. "Perhaps Ms. Carter can clarify." The spotlight hit Amelia like a wave, hot, blinding, merciless. For a heartbeat, she felt like that young woman again, 19, terrified, dismissed, invisible. But then she looked at Zoe standing beside her, chin lifted, eyes steady, and the fear dissolved. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, her voice calm but assertive. "I'm here today not as a victim but as a communicator. A few months ago, I interviewed for a position at Caldwell Communications. Instead of being evaluated on my experience, I was mocked, and my daughter was used as a prop for humiliation." The room fell silent. Every camera lens turned to her. They assumed that because of the color of my skin, because I'm a single mother, because I didn't come from privilege, I didn't belong in this room. They were wrong. And today I stand here not just as a professional, but as the strategist leading Lumatrans Global Communications for our new Russian partnership. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Richard's mask slipped. Rage flashed across his face. "This is a stunt," he snapped. "You're trying to humiliate me. None of this changes the fact that you're inexperienced and yet," Victor interrupted, his voice razor-sharp, "her strategy just secured a $220 million deal that you lost." Laughter, cold and cutting, rippled through the press. Richard's jaw clenched. He turned his glare on Zoe. "And you think speaking a few words makes you special? Zoe didn't flinch. She took a step forward, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "I don't think it makes me special," she said evenly. "I think it makes you ignorant." The room gasped. "You assumed I couldn't do it. You assumed my mom wasn't good enough, and that's why you lost. Not because we're better, but because you were too busy looking down to see us standing right in front of you." A voice spoke up from the crowd. Deep, accented Russian. "I believe this young woman speaks more than a few words." Heads turned as Sergei Morozov, CEO of Rusnet Technologies, stepped forward. The very man Richard had been courting for months. "In fact," Sergei continued, "it was this young lady's translation of one of our public addresses, shared online without even knowing we would see it, that convinced me Lumatrans understands our culture." "That she understands our culture." He turned to Zoe and said a phrase in rapid Russian. Without missing a beat, Zoe replied, confidently, fluently. The room exploded again, journalists practically climbing over one another to capture the moment. Richard looked like a man watching his empire crumble brick by brick. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "No," Victor said coolly. "This is merit, something your company forgot how to recognize." The press conference spiraled into chaos. Reporters fired questions at Richard about discrimination, hiring practices, and the viral blog post. Investors stormed out of the room, phones pressed to their ears. By the time the conference ended, Jack Caldwell Exposed was trending nationwide. For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell wasn't the kingmaker. He was the cautionary tale. Amelia and Zoe stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. A wall of cameras and microphones waiting for them. "How does it feel?" a journalist shouted. Amelia smiled, the tension of years lifting from her shoulders. "It feels like the beginning," she said simply. That evening, as the news cycle devoured the story, an email landed in Amelia's inbox. It was short and bitter. "I misjudged you. Congratulations on the deal. RC." She stared at it for a long time before hitting delete. Some doors, she realized, weren't worth reopening. But then a second email arrived. This one from a national civil rights organization. They wanted Amelia to speak at their annual conference about systemic bias in corporate America. And they wanted Zoe to talk too. "Are you sure?" Zoe asked nervously. "I'm not a public speaker," Amelia grinned. "Oh, sweetheart. You are now." Weeks later, a video clip went viral. It showed Zoe, standing on a stage, microphone in hand, speaking to a crowd of thousands. She talked about her mom. She talked about language. She spoke about being underestimated. And she ended with a sentence that would echo across social media. "They said I didn't belong in the room, so I learned the language of the room and made it mine." The crowd roared. And somewhere in an empty boardroom high above the city, Richard Caldwell watched the clip in silence. This wasn't supposed to happen, he thought bitterly. But it had, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The days following the press conference unfolded like a storm, one that swept through the corridors of power, leaving everything changed. For the first time in its history, Caldwell Communications found itself on the defensive. Stock prices tumbled. Clients withdrew contracts. Shareholders demanded answers. And Richard Caldwell, once hailed as a visionary, became the face of corporate arrogance gone wrong. But for Amelia and Zoe, the chaos outside was nothing compared to the quiet transformation happening within. Their apartment, once filled with anxious conversations and whispered hopes, now hummed with something entirely new. Possibility. Amelia's first day at Lumatrans Global felt like stepping into a world that had always been waiting for her. No one questioned her qualifications. No one made jokes about her background. Instead, they asked for her ideas and listened when she spoke. The company launched a new cultural communications division under her leadership, one focused on bridging language and equity gaps in global business. And Zoe? She had her own desk in the office, an honorary junior strategist position Victor insisted on. "You helped make this happen," he told her with a wink. "I don't hire translators either, but I do hire visionaries," Zoe beamed. For the first time in her life, she felt seen not as a kid who might achieve something someday, but as someone already changing the world. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell tried to control the damage. He issued carefully worded statements about misunderstandings and commitments to diversity. But the public wasn't buying. Former employees came forward with their own stories of bias and mistreatment. Industry watchdogs launched investigations into Caldwell's hiring practices. And in a symbolic blow, a major civil rights group rescinded an award the company had been slated to receive. When a journalist asked Richard if he regretted his behavior during the interview, his answer was telling. "I regret underestimating how quickly stories spread online." The comment only made things worse. What had started as one humiliating interview became a national conversation. News anchors debated systemic racism in corporate America. Social media lit up with hashtags like Dahmer's language eyes power and See Beyond the Surface. Amelia was invited to speak on panels, to consult on corporate inclusion strategies, and to mentor young professionals. She accepted only some of the offers, the ones that aligned with her mission. "This isn't about revenge," she told a CNN host during a live interview. "This is about rewriting the rules. Too many talented people are locked out of opportunities because someone decided they didn't look the part." "That ends now," the host nodded. "And Zoe, how do you feel about what happened?" Zoe smiled shyly, her voice steady but warm. "I feel like people finally heard us, and maybe now they'll listen to others too." The impact was more profound than either of them expected. Scholarships were established in Zoe's name to support young linguists from underrepresented backgrounds. Universities invited Amelia to give a guest lecture on cultural communication. Even companies that had once ignored her resume now called her for advice. But Amelia never forgot the women she'd met cleaning hotel rooms. The single mothers juggling 3 jobs, the students told they'd never make it. So she started something new, a mentorship program called Bridge Voices, aimed at giving them the tools and confidence to break into industries that had long shut them out. "It's not enough to walk through the door," she said at the program's launch event. "We have to hold it open for the next person, too." One afternoon, months later, Amelia and Zoe were leaving Lumitran's headquarters when a woman stopped them on the sidewalk. She was young and nervous, carrying a folder full of resumes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you Amelia Carter?" Amelia nodded, surprised. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman continued. "I saw your story online. It gave me the courage to apply for a job I never thought I could get. And I got it." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. She hugged the woman tightly. "That's the real win," she whispered. Zoe smiled quietly beside her. It wasn't just about them anymore. It had never been. Months later, Richard Caldwell appeared on a televised business panel. Gone was the unshakable confidence. In its place was a forced humility. His company had survived, but barely, and its reputation would take years to rebuild. A reporter asked if he had anything to say to Amelia Carter. Richard hesitated. "I suppose I learned that talent doesn't always look the way you expect." It was the closest thing to an apology he'd ever give, and Amelia didn't need one. Because while Richard's empire was shrinking, hers, built on integrity, resilience, and brilliance, was just beginning. On a warm spring evening, Amelia and Zoe walked hand in hand through the city park, watching kids play soccer as the sun dipped below the skyline. It was the same city, the same streets, but everything felt different now. Bigger, brighter, full of promise. "Do you ever think about that day?" Zoe asked quietly. "Every day," Amelia replied. "Not because of what he said, but because of what you did." Zoe smiled. "I just spoke." Amelia stopped and turned to face her daughter. "You did more than speak. You reminded the world that brilliance isn't defined by prejudice, and that language isn't just words. It's power." Zoe squeezed her mother's hand. "Then let's keep speaking." And as they walked into the fading light, it was clear that their story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. In the end, the story of Amelia and Zoe wasn't about a billionaire losing a contract or a company's reputation crumbling. It was about something far more powerful. The unshakable truth that dignity doesn't ask for permission and brilliance doesn't wait for validation. Prejudice tried to define them. Society wanted to confine them, but they rewrote the script, not by shouting louder, but by speaking fluently in a language that ignorance couldn't understand. They proved that intellect knows no color, that potential isn't measured by pedigree, and that the most significant revolutions often begin with one quiet, defiant voice saying, "I belong here." That could be the lesson for all of us. Every day in classrooms, boardrooms, and neighborhoods, someone is being underestimated, not because of what they lack, but because of what others refuse to see. The question is, will we keep walking past those moments? Or will we speak up, open doors, and challenge the narratives that shrink people down before they've even had a chance to rise? Because somewhere right now, another young girl is listening to a language the world doesn't expect her to understand. Somewhere, a parent is teaching their child to stand tall in rooms that weren't built for them. And somewhere, a new story is waiting to be written. One that starts, just like this one did, with a simple act of courage. So ask yourself, if this happened in your school, your office, your community, what would you do?